The frontier had a way of turning even good men hard, but that winter the drought bit deeper than any the settlers had known in years, and the fear of Apache raids twisted the town of Red Bluff into something uglier than hunger alone could cause. The days were long and dry, the nights sharp as broken glass, and every time the wind carried the faint echo of distant drums. The townspeople felt their hearts lurch as if the whole world waited to see whether the Apaches would descend on them. Like a storm out of nowhere, in that edge-of-the-world settlement lived a young woman named Clara Mayfield, a girl raised quiet and gentle beneath the watch of a strict church-going mother and a father worn down by years of dust crop failure and losses. He never spoke of Clara was not a woman who belonged to violence or cruelty. She had lived her 19 years, dreaming more of open meadows and the sound of cattle lowing at dusk than of guns firing or men riding with their faces painted. For war she carried about her an innocence that seemed to glow even in the half-broken world she lived in, and for that reason alone she caught the eyes of men who did not deserve to look at her. Among them were 3 men whose names were whispered as curses around Red Bluff: Hank Doyle, his brother Mason, and a whiskey-soaked drifter named Pike Brennan. They had been ranchers once, but hard times turned them mean and arrogant, and they blamed the Apache for every dead cow, every stolen horse, every misfortune that darkened their lives. They stirred the town with fear until fear became rage, and rage turned into the kind of talk that makes men forget their humanity entirely. One night at the saloon, after too many bottles and too few reasons to act like decent men, Hank slammed his cup down and swore that someone needed to teach the Apache a lesson, not with bullets but with shame. A message, he called it, something to mock them, something to show that the settlers were not afraid. A cruel idea was born in the haze of liquor and bitterness, and as the lamps flickered low they agreed on it with vicious satisfaction. The next morning Clara stepped out into the cold dawn to fetch water, her hands numb, her breath hanging in the air like smoke. She never saw the men approach behind her, never felt the shadow fall over her until a rough hand clamped around her arm and yanked her backward. Her bucket crashed to the ground, water spilling across the frozen dirt as Mason Doyle shoved a rag into her mouth to stifle her scream. She struggled, but the more she thrashed, the harder they gripped her, dragging her toward their horses. Her father shouted from the doorway, his voice cracking as he tried to run after them, but Pike struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle, sending him collapsing to the earth. Clara watched helplessly as the world she knew slipped behind the rising cloud of dust. They tied her wrists, threw her onto Hank's horse, and rode hard southwest toward the dry ravines that marked the edge of Apache land. Clara tried to speak, but the gag muted everything she tried to say. She could not beg, she could not cry, she could only watch the land roll past in twisted colors of dust and despair, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy with fear. When they reached the ridge, Hank tore the gag away and dragged her onto the ground. He leaned close, his breath thick with whiskey, as he told her that she did not need to fear them anymore because soon she would be the Apache's problem, not theirs. His grin was sharp and cruel, like a wolf that finds joy in tearing apart the smallest creature he can find. They shoved her forward through a narrow pass that opened onto the wide desert plain, the beginning of Apache territory. They knew the warriors traveled this region, knew their scouts watched from unseen ridges. Hank Doyle wanted the Apache to find her, wanted them to understand the insult the settlers were sending. He grabbed Clara by the shoulder, spun her toward the open land, and shoved her hard into the dust. "You want a message," Hank shouted into the wind. "Tell your warriors the settlers send their greetings." Then the 3 men mounted their horses and galloped back toward the ridge, leaving Clara alone beneath the vast, unbroken sky. She rose slowly, her legs trembling, her vision blurring as she looked around. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, only the endless stretch of desert and the faint whisper of distant hooves. She knew enough of the stories told in Red Bluff to feel her stomach twist. She had been taught that the Apache were ruthless savages, that no woman returned once taken. She felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. not willing to surrender to panic. Yet it was not long before the riders appeared from the southern rise, moving with the grace and certainty of men who knew every inch of the land. They approached in a loose circle, their faces painted their eyes sharp as eagles, watching her without a single word spoken. Clara tried to stand tall, but her body betrayed her, shaking like a leaf in a storm. She whispered a prayer, though her voice barely carried beyond her lips. The warriors parted, and a single rider emerged from their ranks, a man larger, broader, and more commanding than any she had ever seen. The wind lifted his dark braids, and the sun glinted off the copper and bone ornaments across his chest. His gaze rested on her, not with fury and not with the hunger the settlers had described, but with a steady, unyielding calm. He looked at her as if he could see the truth of her situation, as if he recognized her fear and the cruelty that delivered her into his path. He dismounted slowly, never taking his eyes from her. He stepped forward, and Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She expected death, expected violence, expected everything the stories had told her. But instead the man knelt to one knee, his expression unreadable, and he touched the dust near her feet with the flat of his palm, a gesture of acknowledgement, not threat. Warriors murmured among themselves, but the chief lifted his hand and silenced them with a single gesture. Clara had no way of knowing his name, yet no way of knowing that this man was feared across the territories, no way of knowing that fate had placed her before the one Apache warrior whose life had been carved by loss and whose heart had been shut away for years. He stood, looked at her one last time, and spoke in a low voice that carried a depth she could feel even without understanding his words. Then he turned to his warriors and issued a command. They gathered around her, lifted her gently as if she were something precious, something fragile, and led her toward their horses. Clara did not know what waited for her in their camp, did not know whether she would live through the night. But she sensed one thing with strange certainty: the man who had knelt before her, the man whose eyes held storms and sorrow together, was not the monster she had been taught to fear, and whatever happened next would be unlike anything Red Bluff had intended. The Apache camp lay in a hidden basin carved by time and wind, a place where the land folded into itself like an old blanket, protecting what was precious and keeping out what did not belong. The warriors rode in with Clara positioned between them, not as a prisoner tied and dragged, but as someone placed under wary protection. The sun hung low, painting the sky in copper and fire, and the scent of sagebrush drifted through the air as if the desert itself welcomed the coming dusk. Clara sat stiff on the horse, her hands clasped tight around the warrior in front of her. She feared moving too much, feared making some mistake that would anger them. Yet each time the horse jostled and she swayed unsteady, the warrior eased her back to balance. Without a word, she sensed respect in their silence and discipline in their movements, something the men of Red Bluff never spoke of when telling their stories. At the heart of the camp stood the chief, the same man who had knelt before her on the plain. His presence seemed to command the very air around him. His broad shoulders cast long shadows across the ground, and his eyes held the depth of someone who carried both wisdom and wounds. Clara felt her breath catch as the warriors approached him and slid from their horses, lifting her down with unexpected care. She landed on her feet, unsteady at first, but she forced herself upright. She would not show fear, not after everything she had already endured. The chief watched her a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stepped closer until he stood just a breath away from her. Clara felt her heart hammering so hard she wondered if he could hear it. Spoken Apache, and though she understood none of the words, his tone was low and firm, his voice steady as stone. The warriors answered him, their voices respectful and quiet. Clara realized they were explaining how they had found her, and perhaps the strange way she had been thrust into their land. The chief listened without interrupting, his gaze moving from the warriors to Clara as if he already understood the truth without needing their explanation. When the warriors finished, the chief stepped closer and gently took Clara's wrist, turning her arm to study the raw red marks left by her captors. His expression flickered darkly for the briefest moment, not anger at her, but at the cruelty inflicted upon her. The other warriors saw it too, murmuring softly among themselves. Clara sensed that the chief's reaction held weight, that his opinion could shift the entire tribe's view of her fate. Then he spoke again. But this time he addressed her. His voice softened slightly, though he never smiled. The words were foreign, but the tone carried comfort, not threat. He motioned toward a nearby lodge, one made of hides painted with symbols she didn't understand. He pointed to himself, tapped his chest, and said a single word slowly so she might grasp. Itatse. She repeated it quietly, uncertain if it was his name or something else. He nodded once, firm and approving. Then he touched his chest again and said it once more. Atsa's name, she realized. The man feared across the territories by settlers and soldiers alike carried a name that rolled like thunder, yet held a kind of solemn dignity. She whispered it again, and he nodded with the faintest hint of acknowledgement. He then gestured to her and spoke another word, one she did not know but sensed was meant for her, perhaps an Apache name or a temporary one until the tribe chose how to see her. The warriors stepped aside, and a woman approached, older, with braids streaked silver and eyes sharp as flint but warm in their own way. She placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder, then motioned for her to come with her to the lodge. Clara looked back once at Atsa, uncertain if he wanted her to go with the woman or if she was being taken somewhere else. But the chief nodded, slowly giving her permission. She followed the older woman, who introduced herself in broken English as Untamed. She led Clara into the lodge, where the air was warm from a small fire and the scent of herbs filled the space. Tay gestured for Clara to sit. She examined her wrist, murmuring in disapproval at the sight of the bruises. Then she mixed a paste of herbs in clay, pressing it gently onto Clara's skin. The coolness soothed the burning ache. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away, stubbornly refusing to show weakness. Noticed, but said nothing, simply working with hands that knew healing well. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was soft, barely audible. "Why are you helping me, Na?" Tay paused, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. Then she pointed toward the entrance of the lodge inn, the direction where Atsa had stood, and said simply, "Chief chooses you safe here." Clara's breath stilled. The chief had chosen to protect her, not use her, not harm her, not treat her as a trophy or prisoner. But protect her? Why, she could not understand. But the truth of it settled into her chest like a small, fragile spark of hope. As night fell, drums echoed through the camp, a slow, steady rhythm. Clara stepped outside the lodge, wrapped in a woven blanket Tay had given her. She saw the tribe gathered around several fires, children laughing, men speaking in low tones, women preparing food. The life here felt harsh but whole, far different from Red Bluff, where suspicion and bitterness hung like smoke. Every day Atsa stood near the central fire, speaking with elders. His voice carried strength, but also restraint. He was a leader by more than fear, Clara realized. He was a man who bore the weight of his people with steady purpose. She watched the way he spoke, the way others listened, the way he moved with calm authority. She stared longer than she meant to, until his eyes lifted and caught hers across the firelight. She stiffened, heat rising to her face, but he did not turn away. Instead, he held her gaze for a long, quiet moment, and in that moment, Clara felt something shift inside her. Not attraction, not yet. Something deeper, something like recognition, as if he saw her not as an outsider, but as someone whose fate had unexpectedly become tied to his when the fire ceremony ended. Atsa approached her, and Tay stepped back, allowing them space. He spoke slowly, using a few English words mixed with Apache gestures. "You safe here," he said, pointing at the lodge, pointing at the tribe, pointing at himself. No harm. Clara swallowed her fear and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice broke slightly. Seemed to understand the tremor not as weakness, but as the exhaustion of someone who had endured more than any girl should in a single day. He bowed his head just once, then said a final word softly before leaving her to rest. Sleep that night. Clara lay on a bed of woven mats listening to the crackling fire outside and the distant murmur of voices. She had expected to face violence, death, or the cruelty the settlers always spoke of. Instead, she had found shelter, warmth, and a silent promise of protection from a man whose eyes held storms, yet whose actions held honor. For the first time since she had been dragged from her home, she felt a sense of safety, as fragile as new snow, but real enough to steady her breath. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she sensed that her fate had changed the moment Atsa knelt in the dust before her on the open plain. Whatever path she walked now would be one the settlers never imagined for her. The days that followed moved slowly, like the steady roll of distant thunder across the desert, each hour marked not by fear now, but by a cautious new rhythm Clara had never known before. The Apache camp woke with the Sun Children running between the lodges, chasing dogs and laughter, while the men prepared for hunting or scouting and the women tended to the fires. Clara watched all of it at first like someone peering through a window into a world she did not belong to, but each day a small piece of that distance fell away. Nate became her guide, showing her how to grind roots, how to weave grass into rope, how to gather water from deep clay pockets near the basin. Clara listened closely, her hands fumbling at first but improving with each attempt. When she made mistakes, Nate never scolded nor laughed. She simply corrected her with patience born from a lifetime of teaching. Clara felt gratitude rising in her chest every time the older woman set a gentle hand on her shoulder. The tribe did not treat her as a prisoner. Some were cautious. Some watched her with narrowed eyes, wary of the settler girl who had arrived among them like a storm blown off course. But none raised a hand to her, none spoke in anger, and gradually Clara sensed a shift in their gazes. They no longer saw her as a burden left by hostile men. They saw her as someone trying to learn, someone who greeted the morning with the same quiet determination that defined their own people. Only Atsa remained distant, yet always near. His presence filled the camp even when he said nothing, which was most of the time. He did not follow her, yet somehow he was always aware of where she stood, always standing between her and anything that might frighten or overwhelm her. Clara felt his watchfulness like a warm shadow, not oppressive but steady and inexplicably comforting. One morning, as the first light crept across the desert, she stepped outside the lodge to find Atsa waiting. He held a second horse beside his own, a small calm mare with a dark mane and soft eyes. He motioned for her to come, then tapped the saddle and spoke one clear word, "Ride." Clara stared at him, then at the horse. Her breath caught. She had ridden before back in Red Bluff, but always on slow farm ponies under her father's watch. Never like this, never with an Apache chief offering his own hand to help her. Mount Atsa waited patiently, his expression unreadable but his eyes steady. Clara stepped forward, placed her foot in the stirrup and hesitated. He lifted his hand, offering silent support. She accepted it, feeling a spark travel between them as she did, and together they eased her onto the saddle. The ride began slow through the basin, along the ridges where the Pasola desert opened in sweeping waves of rust-colored stone and tall grass bending under the wind. Clara felt the Mari respond to her touch, gentle and sure. Atsa rode beside her, neither speaking nor rushing. Let the land talk first, his people believed. And she came to understand what that meant. Mileage passed under their horses' hooves, while Clara learned the patterns of the desert. How the wind told stories, how the circling birds marked the path to water, how the distant hills held secrets of old trails. When Atsa finally spoke, his voice blended with the land itself, deep, low, and steady. "Not all settlers bad," he said. "Not all Apache bad. Some hearts walk same trail." Clara looked at him, surprised by the simple wisdom in his words and the softness with which he spoke them. She found her voice slowly unsure at first, like a child testing a new language. "I was told you were monsters," she whispered. "The Apache that you heard." "Anyone you found?" Atsa did not look offended. His gaze stayed forward on the horizon. "Some settlers told only half of story," he answered. "Some see war and forget peace. Some take land and say Apache wrong for wanting what is ours." Clara let the wind carry away her shame. She understood then that the settlers of Red Bluff had spoken from fear or pride or ignorance. She had believed their stories without ever seeing the people behind them. She felt part of her old world crumble quietly inside her, leaving space for something new, something she was only beginning to understand. They rode until the sun neared its peak, then stopped near a small spring hidden beneath a rock ledge. Atza dismounted first, then extended a hand to help her down. Clara hesitated. She took it. He held her just long enough to steady her, then let go quickly as though unwilling to assume more than she wished to give. They ate in silence, sharing dried meat and cool water from the spring. The quiet felt natural, not strained. Instead, it felt like the land itself was breathing around them, a slow, calm rhythm that settled deep into her chest. Clara found herself glancing at him more often, watching the way the light touched his face, how his dark eyes reflected the sky, how his posture remained strong without being harsh. When their eyes met, she looked away quickly, unsure what stirred inside her. Atza noticed but did not push. He sat with a patience that felt ancient, as if he had learned long ago that some connections must be allowed to grow like seedlings, not forced like storms. As days turned to weeks, Clara's fear faded, replaced by trust, and then by a strange warmth that blossomed whenever Atza was near. She saw how he spoke to elders with respect, how he guided young warriors with firm encouragement, how he carried the weight of leadership without pride or complaint. He was fierce in battle, she knew, but with his people he was gentle, steady, and honorable. One evening, as the sun dipped beyond the hills, Clara helped Day prepare herbs for a feverish child. She worked beside the older woman, crushing leaves using a stone bowl. When the child fell asleep, Day placed the bowl aside and studied Clara with eyes sharp enough to see truth even when it hid behind silence. "Chief watches you," she said quietly. "He sees your spirit." Clara felt heat rise to her face in the firelight. "I do not understand," she whispered. Nate smiled faintly. "You will later." That night, Clara stepped outside the lodge, wanting air, wanting clarity. The sky stretched above her, endless and scattered with stars so bright they looked near enough to touch. She hugged her blanket around her shoulders, breathing the cool night wind. Footsteps approached, soft but sure. Clara turned and saw Atza standing a short distance away, watching her with eyes filled with a quiet emotion she had never seen before, not in Red Bluff, not anywhere. He stepped closer, slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. "She did not move. You learn our ways," he said softly. "You try, you listen, you give respect." Clara swallowed the tightness in her throat. "I have been treated with respect," she answered. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the honesty of what she felt. "You have kept me safe. You have shown me more kindness than my own people gave me." In the end, Atza's eyes softened in a way that made her heart tremble. He lifted a hand, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was careful, reverent, as though afraid she might break. "I will keep you safe always," he said. Clara felt something inside her shift, like a door opening to a world she had never known. Her heartbeat thudded deep and strong, and she looked up into the chief's steady eyes. For the first time, she saw not only the warrior, not only the leader, but the man beneath the paint and scars. A man with a heart capable of fierce loyalty and unexpected tenderness. She did not pull away. She did not speak. She simply let the moment settle between them, warm and fragile like dawnlight touching cold stone. A bond had begun, not spoken, not declared, but real as the desert that surrounded them, real as the wind that carried their breaths into the night. Whatever path came next, Clara knew it would change both their lives forever. The spring wind swept across the desert plains, carrying the scent of mesquite and the distant promise of rain. Clara had come to recognize those winds the way one recognizes the moods of a living creature. Some arrived with gentleness, brushing her hair softly as she worked beside Nate, and some arrived with the restless weight of storms that had yet to break. This morning the wind carried unease, a strange stirring that made the horses snort and lift their heads and caused even the children to pause their games. Clara felt it too, though she tried to focus on grinding herbs for the evening meal. Atza had left earlier with a small scouting group. He always rode out at dawn when the world was quietest, returning hours later with news of buffalo paths or safe water trails. Clara no longer felt fear when he left, but she always felt an ache, a quiet longing that eased only when she saw him ride back into camp. Today that ache simmered deeper, as though some part of her sensed he would return with news she would not want to hear. By midday, the tribe gathered near the central fire as warriors hurried through the camp, speaking in low, urgent tones. Clara caught pieces of their words, though she did not yet know enough Apache to understand fully. She turned toward Nate, who stepped forward, her face lined with concern. "Riders coming," Nate said quietly. "Not Apache." Clara felt her breath grow thin as a thread. Hanate hesitated, then touched Clara's arm. "The ones who left you on the desert, the ones with black hearts." Clara felt cold despite the heat. A part of her had known that day might come, the day Red Bluff realized what they had done, the day fear or guilt or spite drove them toward the Apache again. But she had hoped she might never see her captors again, hoped the desert had swallowed their cruelty long ago. Shouts rose at the edge of the camp as the warning horn sounded. The warriors prepared with calm precision, stringing bows, checking spears, speaking quickly with their chief as Atsa rode in from the ridge, his horse lathered with sweat, his eyes sharp as arrows. Clara's heart leapt in her chest, not just with fear, but with the relief of seeing him unharmed. He dismounted in a swift movement, scanning the camp until his eyes found Clara. She stepped toward him instinctively, but stopped as a group of warriors gathered around to hear his report. He spared her one quick, steady look, a silent promise that she was not forgotten, then turned to address his men. Clara could understand only fragments, but Atsa's tone held no fear. He spoke of approaching riders near the northern ridge, the scent of whiskey on the wind, the tracks of 5 horses moving without caution. He spoke of settlers who rode with arrogance, not respect, and of danger that must be faced with wisdom, not anger. Clara's hands trembled. Dante placed a steady grip on her shoulder. "Do not fear, child," she whispered. "Chief will protect." Clara nodded, though her stomach churned. The men who had thrown her to the desert as a mockery would not come alone. They would come armed, drunk, hungry, to claim something that was never theirs, or driven by guilt, trying to erase the evidence of what they had done, or perhaps simply furious that the Apache had not responded with the expected violence. They had wanted her death as a message, but instead she had lived and been sheltered. Such men did not like when their cruelty failed to achieve its purpose. As the sun dipped lower, the riders appeared at the distant rise, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. Clara felt her heartbeat hammer in her chest as she recognized Hank Doyle's broad shoulders, Mason's narrow face, Pike Brennan slumped in the saddle with that cruel smirk still etched across his mouth. 2 others rode with them, men she did not know, but who carried the same air of recklessness. They stopped a short distance from the camp. Hank raised his rifle in the air, more a show of arrogance than threat, shouting words Clara could not make out from this far away. The Apache warriors stood firm in silence, their bows ready, their faces calm. Clara felt pride swell in her chest at their composure. Red Bluff had always feared the Apache, but now she saw the truth. The Apache were not guided by rage. They were guided by strength and honor, something her own people had forgotten. Atsa stepped forward alone, tall and unmoving like a stone carved by the desert winds. Clara watched him with breath held tight. Hank Doyle shouted down from his horse, demanding the return of the girl, claiming she belonged to the settlers, not the savages. Clara flinched at the word, but Atsa did not react. His voice rose in a deep, calm line that carried across the plains. Clara watched the exchange, though she understood only tones. Hank's anger rising, Atsa's unyielding firmness. The settlers laughed, sneered, taunted. They called her a captured prize, claimed she was stolen by the Apache to shame the settlers. They accused the tribe of crimes uncommitted to justify their hostility. Clara felt fury boil under her skin. Her captors were twisting the truth to suit their pride. Then Mason Doyle lifted his rifle, pointing it at Atsa. Clara's breath caught as the warriors tensed, shifting their stances ready to shoot, but Etza raised one hand, keeping them still. His calm in that moment shook Clara to her core. He stood unarmed before men who had once thrown her into the desert to die. His silence spoke louder than any threat. Clara could bear it no longer. She broke free from Tai's grasp, running toward the front of the camp before anyone could stop her. Warriors reached out, trying to hold her back, but she slipped past them, breathless, heart pounding, until she stood beside Etza, facing the men who had tried to destroy her. Hank's grin faltered, Pike's smirk vanished, Mason swore under his breath. Clara stood with trembling legs, but her voice rose clear, a voice forged from fear, pain, and newfound strength. Leave, she said. I am not yours. I will never be yours. You did not protect me. You tried to kill me. Settlers froze, shock twisting across their faces. Hank spat in the dirt. You choosing them, he barked. You choosing to live with savages after all we done for your folk. Clara's voice sharpened. You did nothing for me. You threw me away like an animal, and they saved me. Whisper ran through the Apache warriors, pride swelling at her words. Etza looked at her with something deep in his gaze, something like admiration mingled with something else, something fragile yet fierce. Hank's rage flared. He shouted that she had been bewitched, claimed the Apache kidnapped and corrupted her. He raised his rifle, but Etza moved before Clara could react, stepping in front of her, his body forming a shield as natural as breathing. His hand rose in warning, and dozens of bows drew back in perfect unison. Hank froze, Mason pale, Pike trembling, the others suddenly realizing they had wandered far beyond their own territory and were now surrounded by warriors who would release their arrows without hesitation. Etza's voice dropped low, a thunderous calm. He spoke in Apache, one line sharp as a blade. Clara knew he warned them that one more act of aggression would end all of them. Then he stepped aside just enough for Clara to be seen behind him, and his meaning became clear. She had chosen her place, and the tribe would honor it. Hank cursed loudly, wheeled his horse around, retreating with the others close behind. They rode away fast, dust rising behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara watched until they vanished from view, her legs trembling under her until she sank to her knees, breathing hard. Etza knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. You safe, he said softly. No more fear. Clara looked up into his steady, unwavering eyes, and in that moment everything inside her broke open. She had been cast away by her own people, left to die in the desert, yet here with the Apaches she had found protection, respect, and something even deeper, something that frightened and warmed her in equal measure. She realized she no longer stood between two worlds. She was choosing one, and she was choosing him. The sun climbed slow and red over the far ridges, and the desert looked like a kingdom forged out of fire and dust and old secrets. And Alina stood at the threshold of that new day with her heart steady and brave in her chest, because the battles had ended and the drumbeats of war had softened into the quieter heartbeat of peace. She had protected with her own courage and her own choice, and she felt something inside her settle like a lone wagon wheel finally finding smooth ground after a lifetime of rattling over broken stones. The Apache camp below was waking in soft murmurs rather than the storm-like tension it once carried, and children ran with playful shouts, and women tended fires that threw up thin blue trails into the morning sky. And the warriors sharpened their arrows more out of habit than necessity, because for the first time in months their lands were not trembling at the approach of enemies. And Elena breathed that peace deep into her lungs and let it fill her with a sense of belonging she never thought she would feel in her lifetime. Behind her the lodge flap lifted, and gray Wolf stepped out, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the packed earth, and his quiet eyes found her instantly, and he studied her the way a man studies the one thing in the world he never wants to lose. And Elena felt her heart warm under that look, because he carried the memory of every moment they had survived together, and he carried it proudly like a man carries a sacred bundle through the storms of his life. He stepped beside her, silent for a long moment, because he knew the value of silence and the way it could speak. love more deeply than any words, and together they watched the village breathe and rise. With the morning, and Elena felt his presence like a strong wind at her back, steady, certain, unbreakable. He finally spoke. His voice was low and honest, and it moved through her. With the warm strength of a desert summer wind, today the council gathers, he said, and they will look to me for what comes next. But my answer is not mine alone, it belongs to us both. Elena turned to him, her hair catching the early light like threads of gold woven into raven black, and she asked quietly, "What do they want to decide?" He looked out over the land for a moment before answering. "The council must name a new path for our people, one that holds peace without surrender, one that carries our strength into the future, and they will ask who will walk beside me and carry that burden." Elena felt her breath still for an instant because she understood. Now what he was saying, though he had not spoken the full truth out loud, and her heart swelled with a mixture of awe and grief and joy, because she knew no matter what role he asked of her, she had already chosen him long ago in the deep quiet of her soul. "I am not one of your people," she whispered. Gray Wolf shook his head slowly. "You stand with us, you bleed with us, you loved us even when you feared what you had stepped into, and the spirits know your heart. Elena, they know the truth of who you are." She felt tears burn the corners of her eyes, because she had never been claimed by any people before, not even the settlers who raised her, with all their cold duty and brittle expectations. And now this fierce and proud nation spoke her name in a way that made her feel like she had finally stepped into the life she was meant for. The council fire was lit by midday, and the flames rose high, bright, and restless, like they too felt the importance of the gathering. And the entire camp formed a great circle around the council stones, and the wind carried the scent of cedar and sage through the air, whispering blessings from the old spirits. Gray Wolf stood strong at the center, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression solemn as he faced the elders and the warriors and the women who guarded the traditions of their people. And Elena stood beside him, her chin lifted, her courage steady, though her heart pounded like hooves across open plains. The eldest council member, White Crane, spoke first, his voice aged and cracked like old bark, yet holding more authority than any gun or arrow. "We stand at a turning of seasons," he said. "We survived the storm of war, we held our land, we kept our people safe, but now a new choice lies before us, and Gray Wolf must choose the one who will stand at his side to lead our future." A murmur passed through the circle, and many eyes turned toward Elena, and though some held uncertainty, many more held respect, because they remembered how she had stood between death and life, how she had offered her own body as shield, how she had chosen them even when her own blood people had tried to drag her away. Gray Wolf stepped forward, and the air grew still, as though even the sky leaned in to listen. "I choose not for convenience, nor for alliance, nor for strategy," he said. "I choose from the truth within my heart, and the truth that ye spirits have shown us all. I choose the woman who came to us thrown like refuse from those who claimed to be her kin, the woman who found strength in her fear and love in the ashes of conflict, the woman who showed us that a heart may cross any boundary drawn by men." His voice deepened with fierce certainty. "I choose Elena." A hush fell so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, and for a long moment no one moved. Then White Crane stepped forward and placed his hand over his heart, bowing his head. "The spirits approve," he said. The words rolled through the circle like a wave, transforming doubt into acceptance and acceptance into celebration. Women lifted their hands in blessing, warriors struck their spears against the earth in honor, children shouted her name with bright voices, and Elena felt her knees weaken under the weight of it all, because she had never imagined in her wildest dreams that she would be honored so deeply by people she once feared. Gray Wolf reached for her hand and pulled her gently to the center of the circle, and though no crown existed in their traditions, the people adorned her with symbols far more meaningful: a necklace of turquoise and bone for wisdom, a mantle of soft doeskin for compassion, and a painted mark on her forehead, the symbol of the rising sun for new beginnings. Elena felt the weight of each offering like pieces of her new identity settling into place. "You stand as one of us," White Crane said. "You stand as our mother of peace, our chosen woman, our queen, in the ways that our hearts understand." Gray Wolf turned to her, then his eyes warm and unwavering, and he spoke softly, but every soul heard him. "From the day they threw you to my people as insult and mockery, the spirits knew your true path, and now standing beside you, I know. I have chosen not just a companion, but the woman who will guide this land long after our bodies return to the earth." Elena felt tears fall silently down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of completion, tears that came from finding the place she belonged and the man she was meant to walk beside for all her seasons. When the celebration rose around them with drums and dancing and the bright laughter of a people reborn, Gray Wolf drew her close, his forehead resting gently against hers, and he whispered, "You were never a gift thrown to us, Elena, you were a blessing sent to us." And in that moment, beneath the sun that crowned the desert and the drums that echoed across the canyons, Elena understood that she was no longer the girl cast away in cruelty. She had become something stronger, something sacred. She had become the Apache queen, the queen of her own destiny, and the queen of the man who loved her more fiercely than the land he swore to protect.